This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
My name's Richard Allen Miller. I worked Army intelligence, naval intelligence for the Pentagon for 6 of 11 years in Army intel. I did mostly the paranormal studies from 1967, 68 through 79. My ex-wife Iona has a very interesting website. We co-author a bunch of books together. She wrote a paper called I Married the Wizard of Oz, where she documents about 50% of what she saw I did for Army intel, and that would be kind of a mind blower. For example, in terms of, I write for Nexus magazine, Emergent Mind. I have a number of other articles out. The one you might find interesting is Synthetic Telepathy in the Early Mind Wars. These are on my website. I start this program with the sun because this is a cymatic-like action on the surface of the sun. There are interference patterns. I'm going to be speaking as a physicist, so I'll try to be precise in terms of what I suggest is what's happening. For example, we now know, and there's a very interesting article in Nexus this month on how crop circles, the ones that are real, are formed with cymatic action for sound phenomena in nature. They form up in about 6 minutes. We've got some colleagues in the Netherlands that have actually filmed the actual forming of a cymatic action on crop circles, how they form. It's like a membrane physics. The talk I'm going to do today will be called The Non-Local Mind in a Holographic Universe. This is the talk that I gave in Amsterdam. We're going to suggest, and I'm going to give you a quick run through, and then we're going to get in more detail. I'm going to suggest that the brain is and we're going to speak in metaphor now, that the brain is a four-dimensional hologram of 5 space. In 1973, I wrote a holographic concept of reality about 10 years before Carl Pribram. Most of my work was classified secret, top secret, so you're not familiar with my work, but I was one of the original architects. In the paper Embryonic Holography, we demonstrated that the DNA was a 3-dimensional hologram of 4 space, who you were, are, and will be. It contained a time element. I'm going to suggest 30 years later that the brain is a 4-dimensional hologram with liquid crystal phases, amorphous semiconductors, other things that are going on in the brain. It's a dynamic 4-dimensional hologram that's constantly changing, and the good news is you can change the movie you're currently enjoying. We're going to talk about how to remap the brain using power tools, and that's what 50% of my talk is going to be about today, is how to take current technologies and apply them on a personal level to change yourself. How to do it. We're going to have all kinds of different things in that regard. These are the 3 magazines that talked about my work. The first was on the DNA to biohologram, both Popov and who's the other scientist? Garyaev are quoting as the original sources on the biohologram, and that's talked about in this issue of Nexus. This one, we started with the Schumann's resonance when Hainsworth died. He died. Dr. Hainsworth was an Australian that was doing work with the Schumann's resonance, which I call voice of the planet, by the way. It is a frequency, it's a geometric thing that has to do with the Earth and geometry of the Earth, which means, page 2, it's not changing. Schumann's resonance is unique for each different planet. Each planet has its own thing. It's an interesting note for those that are Jungian psychotherapists or something. You might find it amusing that Schumann's resonance for Titan is 2.4 hertz, which is the patented hum off your TV that's used in mind control or in brain entrainment. I wonder what that connection means. I wonder, that'd be interesting to connect Titan and the Titans into mind control. Anyway, these 3 papers, of course, Nick Begich was here a couple of weeks ago. The work I did was actually invent some of the frequency bands that were used in HARP. That's one of the reasons I left military. This is a picture of the sun with an actual burst coming off that is precisely identical to the DNA. That means there's metaphor going on here on scales that we can't even comprehend. Later, I'll suggest, for example, that the Hopi sand paintings at one level of observation look like a solid-state physics device. Everything's in metaphor. That's why we're going to talk about the holographic universe as opposed to a quantum universe. Hainsworth was the one that first discovered, the Western Australian that discovered the relationship. I believe it was Bentoff and some of the others in Stalking the Wild Pendulum that talked about the aortic resonant frequencies. Are you people familiar with that at all? Most of you probably are. The heart, I've got actual pictures of the heart being entrained with Schumann's resonance, where it's actually in, and we'll show that in a little bit. But the aortic arch is of such a length that the normal heart rate that beats on this, that pushes up and down on your temporal lobes, which are piezoelectric crystals, there is a form of entrainment that's in the same frequency band that Schumann's resonance is. I'm going to suggest that there's a dialogue going on between you and the universe outside you, and that you're talking to it as much as it's talking to you, and I'm going to be able to show you some physics that it produces phenomena that you can verify or test this kind of hypothesis. Hainsworth had not made the kinds of connections, and what basically was asked was that my wife and I, ex-wife and I, finish his work and publish it, which immediately went into Nexus magazine as the foundations for what Schumann's resonance or voice of the planet is about. It turns out that there are a series of different frequency bands, like Schumann's resonance, where you're forming different kinds of dialogue with the universe. This woman has a very interesting pattern on her coat, and I'm going to suggest when we were working anesthesiology, that's where they always put us, was in anesthesiology. We were at the University of Washington under John Bonica. That's where the heavy lockdowns were with physics. And we were charged at that time, we were working under Nixon, and asked to come up with some models on, was acupuncture real or not? And this was before David Bressler and the San Francisco foundations and some of the other things that later came out of the studies we did. We did the original studies and proposed there was another circulatory system in the body, which we called microtubule, of sodium and potassium ions, that is a metaphor, if you will, on a quantum mechanical level of what's going on in internal state functions, and that it's not probably unlikely that our medicine next year will be a light beam that pokes you on the skin and affects your heart rate or beat or your triple warmer or whatever it is you're trying to affect with this. And the actual look on the body has geometric forms like that. Do you know the psychic thing that, what is it, Wilhelm Reich did, where he had the upper sigh, he goes, you know, that upper sigh where you get that little flush? What happens is you've got microtubules that are spinning in this direction, and that sigh causes them to change direction. You get like a polarity thing, and we believe that that's probably now some kind of a metaphor for psychic healing, magnetic healing, you know, some of the other things that Modiyama and some of the others have done. What do we got for a slide? Basically, the universe can be seen as a big kind of a fluid with all kinds of things going on in terms of how you're dialoguing with yourself. And we suggest that, for example, the Schumann's resonance is responsible for things like the migration of birds and the ability to know precisely where you are. I'm currently reading this very interesting paper at Cornell that's doing studies on magnetodetectors in the skin, you know, having to do with sodium and potassium ions, where we have, you can actually get some pretty accurate readings. Just, what are these links that they use in anthropology now, where they can map where you are on the earth? They're, right. You have something like that in your body already that does amplitude and directional frequencies for various magnetic fields, and can actually position yourself using that. Now, and that's some of the studies that are being done at Cornell right now. They're very interesting. This is a typical aortic heart and brain relationship that's going on between the aortic heart, aortic arch, and the heart. with actual brain waves being monitored off on that, where there's a form of entrainment that's going on. Kids that have a tendency to tap their feet very rapidly and are fidgety and all of that, you'll find that those frequencies that they're doing it are exactly with that with Schumann's resonance. It's a form of entrainment that they use to just sink right into what you would call childish behavior. No, I'm just kidding. Just messing. It's all about frequencies and the relationship of frequencies. This was, of course, Pythagoras in his works formed the concepts of octaves. Later, he worked in the physical plane with Bravais lattices in the way matter unfolds with itself. I did my master's in solid-state physics and found his work to be exemplary, in the 14 different ways matter interfaces. My wife and I wrote a 3-book series called The Diamond Body, Electromagic, and Yogatronics, which dealt with video feedback systems, where we were working with Manfred Klein's and some other works on how to talk to specific neurotransmitters using a device which we called the wire. What I had was a bunch of autogen biofeedback equipment, and I had Mora and Endomet German acupuncture equipment where I could actually wave shape and talk specifically to neurotransmitters on my brain directly in. And of course, if I could talk to one, they could translate and talk to several others, and we could cause behavior changes in you using electromagnetic fields right on the skull. That was some of the early work that we were doing. We wrote some books on that. Tarcher was going to publish those. Human health is linked with geophysical parameters, and this is an extremely important quote from Hainsworth before he died. We are in what I'm going to call an electromagnetic soup. I have an actual picture of what it probably looks like. This is HAARP, and that's what HAARP sounds like. Actually, when they turn HAARP on up in Alaska, you can physically hear it down here in your ear. Yeah, but where our resonance frequencies aren't changing, because that's a geophysical constant. We haven't changed the physical diameter of the Earth and the ionosphere. We're trying to in some ways, unfortunately, but we haven't done that, which means the Schumann's resonance is not changing, and that's specifically to one writer that is a little questionable in his research anyway. What I'm suggesting is that it's unique to given planetary dimensional structures. It's a dimensional physics thing. It's like physics, a physical thing. Right, and you can't just change it by bombing with EM fields. There's got to be some other things that are happening, like your bandwidths are changing in your ionosphere. That could be one thing that could change it, is the widths of it, like we're burning it out and burning holes in it. That could be a possibility. But at this point, we have people that are actually monitoring this, and it hasn't changed really. And we can pick up bullshit trips, though, in the thing. Iona has written some articles in Nexus on that. What was the article? That was with Ben Lone Tree, out of Sedona, one of our colleagues. Anyway, let's see. This is HAARP and what it sounds like amplified. And that's just one of the static things that you're dealing with on a momentary basis whenever they turn this on. It's terrible. This one's based right down here in Alaska, and yet at the same time, you can hear it all the way down here in Grants Pass physically. There's ways of confirming that as well. HAARP? HAARP was originally developed as a weapon for communications. In case we had a big flash in our communication systems and all our chips were fried, we can just ride over the whole and have communications in the microwave band. It was actually, the frequency terms that they're using, though, is unbelievable. It's in the 0.3 to 3 gigahertz region, which turns out to be in the same range that you have sensitivity in your temporal lobes. There's lots of research on that. Again, that paper I would refer you to is called Synthetic Telepathy in the Early Mind Wars. There's devices, for example, that are called like off-the-shelf mind-reading devices. How do they work? Everything that you think in a beta state or in a light alpha state is subvocalized. And if you have microwave, you can read what they're saying, thinking in their head, right off their throat. And that's a device anybody can buy. That's like, we had that in 1970. You understand what I'm going with? So it's beyond things like brain fingerprinting and PGO waves and, using with a P300 marks on mapping the brain and so on. We can get very sophisticated with electronics. This is the kind of soup that we're kind of living in. There's HAARP, there's radar, there's cell phones. The cell phones that we all use right now of all the frequency bands that are up there, Motorola chose this one specific bandwidth in there to do all the cell phones because it has an LD50 ratio. There's too many people on Earth and we need to do attrition. And so we have a lot of things in our physics right now that are meant specifically to reduce masses. Cell phones are one of them.
So you're saying that the cell phones are to get rid of people?
I would say that that's a pretty good idea, one statement, yeah, because they have LD50 ratios. The guy that invented the chip was on 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace 6 times before he died of a brain tumor. And the weird bad is there's secondary smoke, which means we're all in this microwave ovens. You know, you got little radiation curves that are coming off everything. You know, there's devices. I've created a little device you can make where you can, you know, what do you call that? Feng shui, you know, which way you're supposed to put your head and line your body in the room and so on. Some of that has to do with electromagnetic things that are given off here. Lights and the wiring in the room. That all determines where you should be. You should be monitoring where the electromagnetic fields are because they will affect your dreams, which affect your belief systems and your creating realities. We'll get into it. HARP is high aerial atmospheric blah, 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 blah. It has to do resonance project. What they're doing is they're actually reflecting microwave off the ionosphere down to some other location where they can talk to someone. The problem is the amount of amplitude they're using in their gains and so on. Punching holes in the ionosphere. It's also in the 0.3 to 3 gigahertz. Turns out that has to do with a certain bandwidth that you actually hear things. Man has another sensory motor input that we knew about in the late 60s. It was discovered by Alan Frey at Willow Grove. I was the one that did some of the primary work on that. What we were looking at primarily was how the temporal lobes, what you could do is using these frequencies, you could heterodyne voices on that and you'd hear voices in your head. On my article, I have a whole bunch of diagnostics, you know, that can give you whether or not this is, you know, for your doctor to check and so on. These devices are off the shelf now. Anybody can buy them. That means it isn't government doing trips on you anymore. It might be your neighbor. You have enough money, you can buy all kinds of weird things. ELF pollution is associated with a whole bunch of new diseases that we have in our library now in the last couple 20, 30 years. Has to do with the immune system, has to do with related to abnormal cell development, you know, with cancer, has to do with birth defects, infertility, has to do with increased physiological disturbances like what you call yuppie flu, you know, where you don't feel like doing anything, you're just kind of generally in a malaise or depression. Some of that can be associated to microwave. Well, microwave has its good things and its bad things. And, you know, with everything that you do, you have balances on how you might want to work with these kinds of things. Recent studies now show that some of the ELF pollution, and especially that from returning warriors from Iraq, will have kinds of mental disturbances, antisocial behavior, psychosomatic conditions, and neurological disturbances in their brain. Because, of course, I have a picture on my website under the forum section under chemtrails where we actually show what Iraq looked like the first day of war when we used HARP to create the artificial tornadoes that hit in 9 places in Iraq that started the weather and before we even went in there. Then, of course, the first weapon that was used was Project Solo. And people know what Project Solo is? That's correct. It's a supercomputer. It's an airplane that has a supercomputer in it that can broadcast in the microwave band. Why didn't it strike you as interesting? Then hundreds of veterans were coming out of the war, out of the hole, when there's only 1 or 2 GIs with a rifle in the first war that we did. Didn't that strike you? That was mind control at its very finest. We've used that since the early 70s. It's called Project Solo. You can go on the internet and you'll find lots of information on that. Schumann's resonance actually needs to be studied now, and we need to do some serious studies on that. I was asked to teach a bunch of grad students back in Murdoch, which is in the middle of nowhere and on Perth, That's nowhere, pretty much, most isolated city in the world. How to monitor, because they've just put in the central part of Australia a secondary array of HARP that's even larger than the one in Alaska. And there's a whole series of these all over the place right now. These talk about the different things that I wrote about, we wrote about, Iona and I. And then, of course, the synthetic telepathy paper, you want to make a reference to that. I did that this was my first coming out paper in 30 years. I wrote this for a rave that was held over in Sisters. And that seemed to attract quite a bit of interest and attention, and then so I started writing again. You'll find some new articles on my website that are going up every day, just to keep you informed on what I'm writing about. The non-local mind is what I call the first step toward taking charge of your own physical immortal development. What we mean by non-local is a way of relating yourself to your environment. And you have, of course, your consciousness, and you have all the axioms like, I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't have believed it. You know, these things that we have. That was one of my big banners in the early years on my website. I gotten that as a Selma cartel joke. Well, I married someone from Selma, and that's what they did there, is they had a big cartel of growers. And it's a very cool place, actually. Grants Pass, the Southern Oregon down here, the state of Jefferson, is a very cool place to live. So this comes to about the midpoint of my talk, where I'm going to talk about what is a metaphor, but to feed your paradox. That came from Gregory Bateson, good friend, and had taken his class, Paul Gregory, out of New York City. And I thought a paravox and meta. What's your metaphor but to serve your paradox? And it gives you the idea that the concept of metaphor is the same thing as hologram. If I took a picture of myself and I squeezed it down to the point where you couldn't resolve what it was, it would still be a picture of me. Quantum mechanics has indeterminacy, and what we have entanglement and decoherence. In holographic systems, you have information and resolution of information. And the system that you use to look at what's going on, at what level you're looking at, determines your resolution. We're going to talk about that later in terms of the real people and how they use magic. But I think physics is a lesser form of magic. And I'm speaking of magic as a system of unfoldment or processes to determine what's going on. The old mechanicalistic form of the brain, the mind, was some product of brain tissue. We're now suggesting that it actually is something more that's like a hologram being projected. What a hologram basically is, and I should probably get into a better picture of that. Well, we're in a revolution right now in terms of how we choose to see what's going on in our reality. There's many options that we have, and none of them work. I don't know of any law in physics that's lasted longer than 20 years. The only one that I've seen that has endured was Maxwell when he was trying to hitchhike out of this galaxy with his right-hand rule of thumb. You know, I mean, that's pretty much the only thing I've seen that has endured in physics in more than 20 years. And so our concepts now is that there's something going on in the brain that is more than what we understand from a biological point of view. And there's many different forms of approach to this. The quantum, what's the bleep forms with Ramtha and those people. But I think we're going to find that the quantum mechanistic views are no longer applicable for the systems of where we're trying to go with ourselves. And that really what we're going to have to do is find some way to bring consciousness and the mind back in with the body. We'll talk more about that in the talk here tonight. This is a typical idea of what I call remapping the brain. I just take my jacket off, and I'll let you. Yeah. I've got lots to talk about, so we can talk all night if you want to. No, I mean, I'm kind of going through this very quickly. I'm not trying to give you. This is a typical process of where a monkey has lost a limb and how we've discovered how he has remapped his brain to account for that missing limb. Okay, like this arm, for example, is less than the other arm. I don't have any bone from here to here. There's no bone in it. And so I have learned how to adapt. You never even noticed that I had no arm other than you thought it maybe was a little smaller. You wouldn't notice that because it's incredible how the human body can adapt and remap situations in the way it uses things in the brain. And this is a typical example of what we first understood of how to remap the brain. Since then, there have been some sciences that have been done in terms of how to set up different structures in the brain using, these are CAT scans on brains like mine, where I've actually, how do I put this? All my life I've been interested in spiritual path working. I'm a satsangi, you know, I meditate, but I haven't really been meditating 2.5 hours every day like we all know we're supposed to. And we've been naughty. We've been putting it off, waiting for that time when just before we're about to kick off or something, we're going to start our meditation and somehow catch up with God. But how do you do it when you're 62 years old like I am? You know, and you're just about running out of space here. And how do you catch up with the spiritual paths that you're supposed to be? Remember, spirituality isn't what you do, but how you do it. And so what I tried to do is use my physics to jumpstart my meditation. And to that end, I started with Holosync and Hemisync. I knew Monroe when he was still at Berkeley before he'd moved to the foundation. How many people are familiar with Holosync? And okay, and you've probably Centerpoint.com and Bill Harris and the bullshit he does up there. And yeah. Okay, he's got a lot of Scientologists around him, so you got to be really careful where you're hanging out there. But that's the baby in the bathwater. And there's some technologies in there that are absolutely valid. And Holosync has taken in less than 2 years, I now have the brain of someone that's been meditating for 30. You're working from a different place in the brain. How does that all work? Well, when I was being born, there was some weird doctor that tried to chop my penis off, circumcision. Now imagine what prenatal and natal traumas might do to your belief systems in parts of your body and how they integrate into your current behavior patterns for how you run your life today. And mostly those aren't valid. And so how do you change those belief systems? How do you go in and change something that isn't working for you, like throwing a tantrum when something doesn't work, really work on it, and that doesn't work? How do you change that kind of belief system? Even most of your psychotherapies don't even address those kinds of issues. They don't suggest, that before we can, make you a better human being, we have to go back and change your value systems, belief systems. It's really difficult to get a handle on that. Most psychotherapies don't even address the issues. The ones that do are pretty much ineffective. The only way that you can actually see a belief system is usually from a witnessing point of view, where you're working from a different perspective in your brain and you can look at your behavior and watch how it's happening. Now, we have descriptions in psychology that talk about that as the first trail for making changes in yourself, that you start acknowledging, being able to see where you're making your errors and so on. But to actually chunk it down into values is a very difficult thing to do, and the only way you can really do that effectively is if you work from a different place in the brain and you look at yourself while you're doing these behaviors. Now that takes some real serious work. Persinger and Todd Murphy have written some very interesting things on enlightenment in the brain. The shifting fluid network also suggests that our consciousness and awareness is not necessarily localized. That when we have temporal lobe seizures, where we'll have a hit with God, like with dimethyltryptamine or something of that nature, that you have a hit with God or you have a close encounter, that's now been determined that temporal lobe seizures are absolutely required to have that. Now, that may be the way God talks to you, but in order to induce these kinds of things, there's all kinds of drugs. I have a friend that writes this paper. It's called Ethogen Review. He's the editor for Ethogen Review. His name's Trout. And he says some plants aren't even plants. What they are is delivery systems from God. Dimethyltryptamine, some of these other things that have crabgrass. Those cows out there chewing their cud, they're having close encounters. You know, they really, trust me when I tell you, there's something terrible going on out there. And these plants are all around us, and doesn't it strike you strange that the most common of grasses, Phalaris, the crabgrass, has a neurotransmitter, a 5-alpha dimethyltryptamine, that is exactly the same as in your pineal gland. I mean, that's a remarkable coincidence. And so there's something else going on here that we're not yet grokking in terms of how it interfaces with our life. What I'm trying to show you is that there is a relationship in the way, again, the resolution of information and how you choose to look at the different systems and how they all relate to each other. And all of this, all the way down through, can be associated with cymatic-like action. You know, the interference patterns, frequencies, and the way they resonate or not resonate with each other to form certain kinds of sacred geometry, other things of that nature. Tim Leary was the one that taught me. He had invented the concept of neurologic circuits. And the one that I was most interested in is that fight-flight syndrome, the noradrenaline-serotonin loop. You know, when you come out of the womb and everything's hostile and you go into this fight-flight thing, and that's the first engram. That's probably neurologic path that's burned in the brain that's convoluted. And so it forms a geometry in the way it gets around from one site to the other. And that probably is the start of what we call sacred geometry on a physical plane. In the brain would be these preferred pathways of engrams that are burned in during these different kinds of neurologic circuits. The hologram, of course, what makes a hologram interesting is what it is actually. A hologram is n dimensions of information that has been compressed into n-1 dimensions. And that is, when I worked at DuPont, I was in grad school back east, and I was at the experimental research station in Wilmington, and one of the labs near mine had an actual three-dimensional color television in operation. This is 1967. I saw it. And I saw three-dimensional TV. And they were using Gaber's work, and this is where I first got into the concept of hologram, was its application to taking flat information and somehow creating a three-dimensional image out of it. You know, taking 3 dimensions of information, constructing 4, or taking 2 dimensions of information like a negative, like we do with this, and creating a 3-dimensional image of it. Now, which is real? I have a very interesting paper on a holographic concept that was presented in Prague, 1973, that you might find very interesting because we laid down the physical foundation for biological processes in that. It was all based on Northrop and Burr's work out of Yale. And then later Leonard Ravitz and others had started writing about this kind of stuff on how biological processes could be likened to electrical circuits and the way they were responding with frequency bands and discharges. That's why I did my master's in bioluminescence and solid-state physics. Very interested in this. Now, this is an example of how the last year's Nobel Prize, which was the, what was it called? That's the this is the idea that a particle was at this location is somehow related to a particle out here at infinity, and that the two were somehow related. And what I'm doing is, in this one I had a picture of the same fish with 2 different cameras, so that when you see these 2 particles, actually it's the same particle, it's just with 2 different cameras, or resolution of the hologram that you're looking at. And this was the, not the Helmholtz, what was I've got brain lock on it. It's on my notes, but it's last year's Nobel Prize went on to. Can you help me on that one? You don't remember what it's called either. Yeah, it was. It had to do with the relationship of 2 particles that were at infinite part with each other. There's a name for it that had to do with I forget what it's called now, but in any case, what I was doing here was showing that the relationship in a holographic universe, you could say that those 2 particles is really the same fish, you know, viewed from 2 different cameras. And that's like your resolution of information, how you choose to chunk what you're seeing. We've got everything all mixed up here. What's that? No, yeah, it was called the, this is another example of a hologram as in a fractal form. I'll find that real quick, like. Filters and the points. I'll remember it'll come to me because I do have a good What we have here is, again, like a hologram where you start with a certain mathematical structure, and at any level, it's the same structure. That's what a fractal is, and that's probably why we're using fractals mathematics to describe holographic systems. The fractal math is very useful, especially the secondary series of Julia and May. What I was going to try to say is that Hopi sand paintings and Buddhist sand paintings at some level made with dissimilar materials look like a solid-state physics device. And so at some level of looking at what's going on, they affect the weather. How does that work? It may be that what we've got is a kind of a solid-state physics device on a different kind of a level. And the way the Buddhists turn it off is with a sweep of the hand. There's metaphor in all of this, and that's why I'm trying to suggest a kind of holographic concept. Now, this is some work I did on extrasensory perception before TARG and your remote viewing, which we called astral projection. I did all the studies for Army and Navy on extrasensory perception. We had several thousands of patients that we examined, and we did some things. And out of that came some mathematical equations. I have a new book on ESP induction through forms of self-hypnosis. And the postulates start is that the conscious experience, what you're doing every time you think something in your mind's eye, you create what we call a thought form. And it actually has an organ of psi energy. I'm going to postulate that it has an actual piece of what we call psi energy, which is the energy which patterns randomness. The second postulate said that it was arbitrarily defined as the equivalent of an extrasensory perception in what our three-dimensional world is called energy. It's not energy, but let's liken it to energy so we have some kind of understanding of what a thought form might actually be. The correlate to this is that ESP is not connected with time. When Edgar Mitchell did the Apollo 14 mission studies, we had access to research where we had, for the first time studying ESP, where we had long distances in space. We had the other side of the moon so that we had large bodies between us. And we made some discoveries that psi energy was independent of time. It could not be converted into heat or light, but it had its own form of relationship to itself, and that it operated by manipulating physical energy. Somehow or another, it was a higher level of energies to what we would call energies at this level. This later led in physics to a whole bunch of different dimensional physics concepts, to include string theory, M theory, Christ multi-world theory. There's a whole raft of them. Our latest article on the website that you'll find interesting is that God is obsolete, where we do a review of all of these different kinds of models and showing where they're deficient in terms of trying to explain what's really going on in the world. The next was that postulate 3 is a representative of psychokinetic phenomena, PK. In other words, in the original studies that Ryan did, we talked about ESP being processes that occurred inside the body, and anything that occurred outside the body physically here was called PK. I'm going to suggest that the body doesn't stop here, and that PK and psi are the same kind of energy form. And that really, again, it comes to do with where you choose to draw where your body actually ends and where something else starts. The next series of postulates, this will later lead, was a product of some aspect of the metabolic processes. This came from Andrea Puharich in his works with Beyond Telepathy. He was one of my teachers. Yes, sir?
Do you have anything to say about him and the nine and all that?
What?
The nine.
The nine?
That he was involved with?
I'm not in this lecture, no, but yeah, I can talk about that. Puharich was one of my teachers and was a brilliant man until we busted Geller. And Geller was his protege at SRI, and that pretty much fried him in his careers. It was real awful what happened. We caught Geller cheating. But we'll talk about that later. It's not appropriate here. The generation of psi energy rapidly decreases with mental alertness. That means that when you start to think something, like you want something to happen or you want to see something, what happens is there's a pushing backward wave that causes you to shift to something else. Okay, this is just a postulate right now, and we'll show you where this is going to go mathematically. That each conscious act has a limited duration. When you try to generate a thought form and hold it, even with hypnosis, it's very difficult to hold it for a very long period of time. You have to, keep adding to it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The second was that we experience a permanent train of changing thoughts. You're constantly, you can't keep that's what the concentration as opposed to meditation was about, is to be able to hold the thought and be able to hold it thought and then be able to hold the thought and keep it. It's the same thought. And it changes. And that why our attention permanently shifts from one thing to another because of this pushing backward wave. It does not want to see this thing formed into the physical world, and so there's a type of a resistance that pushes back, and so you have to, I'll show you how that all works here. When you think of psi energy, automatically decreases the level of alertness. Okay. The intensity of concentration, that's where you get in hypnosis, where you can bring your thing down and you can really focus on it to the exclusion of the sound of a generator or the fan or something else making noise over here. You're listening mostly to my voice. That's level of intensity of your concentration. That is a measurable concept. And so the first equation that I wrote was that the small particle of psi energy that's created over a period of time is equal to some geographic constant times the intensity of concentration on holding that thought. That's why hypnosis is so powerful a tool. And that basically explains what I'm talking about there. Now, that means in a different form that the total energy that's formed is equal to this intensity times how long you can hold that time. And the more reasonable equation is that if we can't hold that thought long enough, it would seem as if we could repeat it over a period of time, the same thought, like channeling the same kind of thought, like love or whatever you do, that at some point it will become physical manifest. That was my mathematical equation. Here is the mapping of the brain that I've been doing using Holosync that has moved me in the last few years to going from this part of my brain, which they have marked in some very interesting articles, and has shifted it to a different part of my brain. That can be confirmed. I've now got the same kind of a brain as someone that's meditated 30 years. It turns out bliss states, these jhana states, these higher cosmic states, there's 8 of them, by the way, are actually forms of shock. When your brain can't cope, it goes into bliss, plateaus. And that's what the different levels of bliss are about. There are levels of becoming capable of coping with what's happening in that state. The thing that's interesting is that meditation is only one part in the brain. There's other places in the brain that you can go besides, frequency following function that drives you into meditative states. That's what we're experimenting right now with. Brain waves, this is some stuff that I wrote in the early years. I did all the early stuff for Menninger Foundation, University of Washington, some of the other things. Remember Jack Schwartz? We were the people that measured the stuff at the Menninger Foundation for Elmer Green when we set up our biofeedback labs. That's what we were doing, was measuring, his ability to gate pain. That was very interesting concepts. And we have different brain states. These are my definitions. Everybody has a little different. This is the ones that I use here. And the reason I mention that is that because some of these states are very important. When you're in these states, you can do things you can't do in your conscious state. That's why meditation and going into meditative states where your brain is working from a different place has got some function to it in terms of creating your thought forms. In terms of, I've created a whole series of power tools, and what we're going to do is probably take a little bit of a break right now and take a few questions first, and then I'm going to spend the second part of my talk on some of these tools that you can use to actually make changes in yourself. What we're all enjoying right now is what I call this horror on Elm Street with Bush and Iraq and the news the way it is every day. We're all enjoying this terrible, terrible movie, And I'm going to suggest it's possible to change what you're seeing and experiencing. Money, things of that nature, immortality even. Are there questions so far before we take a break? Okay, let's go ahead and take a quick break then.
Okay, we have a question here with Joy.
Yes, sure. Cool.
All I wanted to see what Hainsworth had said. I didn't.
Oh, you
get
want to
it.
see what Hainsworth said?
Yeah, that quote.
So we can go back to him if you
Can we
want.
go back?
Yeah, we sure can. Let's go back. The frequencies of naturally occurring electromagnetic signals circulating in the electrically resonant cavity bounded by the Earth and the ionosphere have governed or determined the evolution or development of the frequencies of operation of the principal human brainwave signals. In particular, the alpha rhythm is so placed that it can, in no circumstance, suffer an extensive interference from naturally occurring signals. That's what your voice of the planet does for you. That's how Gaia talks to you. Okay, we'll go ahead and take a little bit of a break and we'll pick it up after that. Duncan, when he asked me to write for Nexus, he told me not to scare all you people, but to leave you feeling empowered. You know, like there's something that, you know, can come out of this that's positive. I haven't got a clue what that is, but I have been experimenting on myself because in order for me to be credible, I better be walking my talk. And so I've been using Holosync for more than 2.5 years. And they have a life integration course. I've done that. I've done several other things. And we're doing some other experiments with Holosync. I use Holosync now. The systems I'm using are no longer with Centerpoint, but some special stuff we've made up ourselves. I'm sorry? Can you explain what that is? Yes. Sound tools like Holosync and hypnosis. Holosync came out of Monroe Institute originally, where they were using a thing called hemisync, and they found that if you had 60 cycles going in at this end and 66 cycles going at this end, it would brain drive you down into 6 cycles or low theta. These are called brain drivers. There's a whole series of different ones on the internet. You can download them for free. There's a variety of them that are using audio as well as video. Not just sound, but they get into sacred geometry. I had a movie that I wanted to show you from the internet. If I could go on the internet, I have an incredible movie that's called Sasquatch Mountain, and it shows how the Sasquatch is raising our consciousness, type of thing. It's an interesting video. I'm sorry? I'm going to give you the website.
We have wireless. We can try that if you want.
I'm wireless. If you can get me up on the internet right here, I'll be happy to run some video for you. I mean, some really unbelievable. It's eidetic imaging, where they're actually using this light and sound like drugs to change your consciousness. And there'll be a story, and there'll be subliminals, and all kinds of things masked in to create an experience. So if you can do that, I'm going to give you a website if you'd like.
Okay.
On the World Wide Web, I'd like you to go to larrycarlson.com/flash movies, HTML, HTM. And specifically, I'd like you to look at, I'm sorry? Once more, larrycarlson.com/flash movies.htm.
Flash movies?
Yeah, Flash movies. Flash is part of the multimedia that I'm using here. It's a multimedia thing. Let's see if we can't. Okay, we're going to talk about power tools. Okay, we're creating a whole series of integrated tools to change yourself into becoming essentially, in some ways, immortal, if you'd like. Anything that you could possibly imagine is possible, is probable at some point in the brain in terms of its view of the movie. Timelessness and so on. When I was doing Tai Chi, I had a Sifu that taught me how to change my perception of time so that I could experience it as extremely slow, okay? But actually I was doing Hung Gao. And so time, it was able in Tai Chi, the real forms of Tai Chi, before they had martial arts and all of that, the forms of Tai Chi taught you how to change your perception of time with your Tantian, your breathing. It's done with breath. And if you know how to do breath control right, you can experience your movement in slowness. And yet be moving quite rapidly. But your experience of it can have the form of having the right roundness and so on in terms of how you move your body. But that took many years to learn how to do that. You know, he didn't even teach me anything but how to walk for the first year. I wasn't taught even double sword or any of that stuff, which is eighth movement. Sacred geometry is used because certain kinds of cymatics or the sacred geometry forms will actually cause resonance in certain parts of the brain when you look at them. That's what mandalas are about. They cause a certain kind of internal resonance that allow you to do things or vision things that you couldn't normally do. Of course, improved nutrition is the bottom line. You are what you eat, and so what you put into your body becomes extremely important. We're going to talk a little bit about that because I've got some new inventions in that area using some pharmaceutical mushrooms. Moving meditations. All of you know that you should be doing some kind of breathing exercise, whether you're jogging, riding a bicycle, Tai Chi, yogas of any form, all require some kind of tithing to your control of breath. It's the first thing you do when you come out of the womb. It's the last thing you do when you leave this place. It's a breath. And so you should be always practicing on your breath control. And then, of course, honest journaling. And I referenced some of the original stuff, the Sinoid stuff and so on, the way you make journals. But this is in magic, what Crowley called the magical memory. Because your memory is arbitrary. And what you remember, what happened, is completely arbitrary to what really happened. And when you kept a journal on it, that's pretty hard to lie. You know, you can go back and see what you felt and what you thought. And so having a diary is like essential in terms of these power tools. Keeps you honest with yourself. The first one I'm going to talk about is Holosync, which is a brain driver. I have this lecture is a very small portion of a new book that my ex-wife and I are writing called Techno-Shamanism. And it's on how to use these tools to physically change yourself and make yourself different. Change your value systems, change your belief systems, change your way of being. Personality quirks or characterisms that you may want to change. How do you do that? Using power tools, you know, where it's very quick and simple. It isn't like an ordeal. It takes years in some cases. Holosync turns out, this is at centerpoint.com. I like their initial intros in the Centerpoint. Centerpoint is P-O-I-N-T-E, centerpoint.com. And that's, if you met Bill Harris, you wouldn't want to have anything to do with him because he's a carny person. And mostly I wouldn't spend any money there. Well, I wouldn't spend any money with there. But I'll tell you that some of the stuff they're doing is actually quite valid. And that's unfortunately also why the whole place is milling with Scientologists and all the rest of these weird beings that hang out in that kind of area.
So does their hardware work, the headset thing?
The headset isn't really the hardware. What you want, and we'll get into that in a moment, is you need a low frequency responding headphone. I found that, what's the one that I used? It's a cheap one from Walmart. It's, do you remember? No, you don't remember that one either. She's not in very, yeah. It's an inexpensive headphone. They're different. The Sony doesn't start until around 20 cycle, and what you're looking for is something around 12 to 8 cycle where it first starts cutting on, and that's where your virtual audio is going to work. I actually have a demonstration of virtual audio here in a minute. If you can't hear it in the stereo, if you heard this in this, it'll scare it. There's nothing else like it. You can't hear that with this. With the sound systems, I can do a sound that nobody in this room has ever heard the quality of before. And this is with a virtual audio system that comes off the internet. They have equipment that you can buy, and it has to do with the way they map out the digital sound. It's quite amazing. And what we're doing now is we're integrating that in with Holosync so that we have subliminal voices that are inside your head. You can't talk. It sounds like you're talking to yourself. It's the same level of you talking to yourself, only they could be commands like to lose weight or whatever you wanted to commit yourself to doing. We also do applied sacred geometry. This is some artwork that Iona did that is the holistic Kabbalah in a number of different directions. It's known as the throne chariot of God or the diamond body. It's a face-center cubic hexagonal crow's back structure. It was Ezekiel's vision, probably. And we're going to suggest that when you have certain kinds of geometries in your mind's eye, you can actually change resonant patterns in the brain and cause your brain to act differently because of that. An example, and I'm going to just run a few of them down here. I guess we'll just go on without showing the eidetic imaging, unfortunately. Improved nutrition is another area of interest to us. When I left Army Intelligence, what I did is I became an herb farmer. For the last 30 years, that's what I've been doing, is farming herbs. And I've written a bunch of books on that subject, the potential of herbs as a cash crop, native plants of commercial importance, forest farming, that kind of thing. And I write for Richter's and so on. But what I'm bored with the herb trade. The pharmaceutical trade in North America has become the new mafia. It's not. It absolutely is true. Yeah. So we've invented a new food, which I have a whole slideshow on that I was going to give you tonight. That's called the Cordyceps sinensis. It grows at this altitude at 15,000 feet in Tibet. Grows off dead insects. It's a very, very tiny mushroom that we now grow in laboratory conclaves down out of Santa Cruz. We grow about 50,000 pounds a month. We have a $100 million facility, which is, we've got our own processing center. We've got tableting and encapsulating in-house. And actually, we're moving, and we may move that facility here to Grants Pass, Oregon. That's one of 3 locations that we're looking at right now. And I don't know if we'll be doing that or not. The Cordyceps sinensis is what I did is we injected, well, I didn't do it, some of the group, John Holliday and so on, they injected a diamondback rattler venom in the mycelium, and I'll show you that slideshow in a little bit, where we hybridized the mushroom so it was real high in beta-glucans and polysaccharides. How many people know what those are? Have some idea what beta-glucans are? Right. We increased the level to 5.3 times the beta-glucans and polysaccharides by hybridizing this. It became a miracle drug. One of the studies we were given 3,000 AIDS victims in Ghana by the United Nations. In 6 months, we had a 100% recovery in all 3,000 individuals. There was no traceability of AIDS in their blood. We've done similar studies locally here with the domiciliary. We have 6 individuals that were on interferon with hepatitis C. 5 of them are now off interferon. No traceability in their blood with hepatitis C. We now believe that AIDS and HIV is actually not a virus, but a mycobacterial that doesn't filter. And this is going to be my swan song, or my exit from the herb trade, is leaving this mushroom as one of the things that I've done as a Rudolf Steiner type in going into agriculture. This mushroom is unbelievable. What it does is it increases your ATP levels in your brain by 37%. That's where the energy you see that I have. It's like remarkable. In fact, it's so remarkable, I might suggest, what age do you want to be? I'm not kidding. It's unbelievable, and we're only just now beginning to understand how it works as a symbiont in the body, as a symbiont, not a parasite. I have it for sale. I represent Aloha Medicinals out of Santa Cruz. You can get it off my website, or you can buy it from me using PayPal or whatever way you want to do it. Yes, ma'am.
Do they use it in Tibet?
I'm sorry?
Do they use it in Tibet?
In?
Tibet.
Oh, yeah. This is their primary. This was the emperor's. Yeah, this was what kept him so-called immortal. It took hundreds of coolies to pick enough for one person. What we do is we grow mycelium in laboratory conclaves, and we harvest the fruiting cap, the mycelium, and the broth as a full spectrum of chemistry. And then we produce that in powders, of which I now have a 40 nanometer product that we now are offering as a new delivery system. What we're trying to do is create a whole bunch of different power tools that you can use to change your life. And this thing will get rid of any kind of cancer.
Do you have a patent on that?
I'm sorry?
Do you have a patent on it?
Yes, we do. As a matter of fact, we do have patents, patent pending. We also, the Cordyceps sinensis hybrid is now being used by mainland China, who buys most of our product, as the primary inoculant in avian flu. It's an antibacterial, antifungal. And I'm talking about on a level that's never been covered before. It's remarkable. This was the technical presentation I gave down in Anaheim, and there were certain things I couldn't say at the World Nutraceutical Conference. I couldn't talk about it that way. It's kind of interesting. I've also given you some other forms of Tai Chi and yoga where you're doing breath control. These are extremely important to integrate into your body with foods and some of the high-tech physics that we're using. Journaling. I liked Jungian Senoid dream work manuals, but Stefan Kaplan-Williams' book was pretty good to me. But honest journaling is critical, and there's many different forms of it out there, and that's one of the other things that you absolutely need to do is keep a record of what you're doing so you know where you were and where you are. You can go back to see where you were. You don't guess or use your memory, which is falsifiable. You can change your memories easily enough. I then usually end my talk by saying, as chemistry has come out of alchemy, so now magic will come out of physics. For centuries, magic was reserved for the ultra elite of Europe, and it wasn't until this last century when magic was defined by drugs that you were using, LSD and some of the other things, that it kind of fell in disrespect. But I think you're going to find that magic is a higher form of physics. In my opinion, that's how I see what magic is. I have that on my license plate, and I've got a little OTO tag. I belong to the Order of the Silver Star and Aurum Solus and a variety of other clubs that I joined years and years ago. When you didn't find answers in physics, where do you go next? I went into the Kabbalah. I didn't find answers there either, but it certainly opened more doors for me. And then I always like to end with the angel from the abyss. Yeah, you know, as a life form. The life forms around us are all around us, and we're not noticing them. If you were to see Earth as a petri dish that the gods were out here on the rim doing their biological experiments, it's probably not about man. It's probably about cetacean, starting with orca and your dolphin and your pilot whales and so on. If you wanted to know who God is, not our God necessarily, but God, it'd probably be orca. It has a cerebral cortex that's twice the size of man. It's firing 60% of its cerebral cortex. It's able to do things and go places with its brain that we have no comprehension of at this point. And so that's where we're trying to do is learn how to use other portions of our brain. And you can do that with technologies like Holosync and so on. I have demo tapes and other kinds of things that I'd be happy if there's little clubs of you that, you know, where I print up and then you print it out for a group of you and that kind of thing. I have some discs and so on that get you started in some of these experiments if you're interested. What I want to do next is open up my other PowerPoint show. Okay. This is the talk I gave down in Anaheim, and I'm going to just give it to you briefly so you get some idea about it. The discovery of Cordyceps sinensis was done out of Tibet. It grows at 14,000 feet, so it's real miserly in its DNA structure. We have a very interesting article on my website that's in the International Encyclopedia of Herbs on Cordyceps that talks about the site specific on the DNA chain, site 23 and 27, where we slip oxygen molecules in it. It's a true symbiont. From the wild, it's helpful for such problems. This mushroom now, with serious illness, coughing, eczema, lower back, all of these have been clinically proven. So I have clinical studies ad nauseam in depth on all of this stuff. Reduces phlegm, stops hemorrhaging, has a tonic effect on the lungs and kidneys. And diabetes will take your diabetes, if you're a diabetic, and bring your swings down to 1/4 the swing when it cycles back and forth on your blood sugars. That's what Cordyceps sinensis does. This is a mushroom that grows off of larvae and dead insects. It requires the dead insect and larvae for the DNA on them to get the oxygen molecules so that it can perform normal processes up at 14,000 feet where the oxygen is very low. It becomes a very important symbiont to insects because it doesn't harm the insect. What it does is it fools its immune system, and insects don't have cancer. Neither will we shortly. This is a typical of the mushroom growing off larva. Parasite or symbiont, this gives you the distinction between what a parasite is and what a true symbiont is. And these pharmaceutical mushrooms like reishi, maitake, and your agaricus blazei, some of the other Coriolis and other things that we're growing, we have about 29 pharmaceutical mushrooms that we grow in our laboratory. I'll show you what they look like here in a minute. This is a definition of cordyceps in terms of what we're doing is not only the fruiting body, we do the mycelium and the broth that it's in, and we give you what's called full spectrum because the chemistry in the mycelium is different than that in the fruiting cap, and it turns out some of your beta-glucans are more important in the fruiting body than they are, let's say, in the mycelium or the broth, or vice versa. This is...
Oh, you skipped one, I think.
I did? Yes, Okay, this is what it would look like in the way we're growing in laboratory conclaves. These are in controlled environments. We'll have different mushrooms like that. We'll do about 50,000 pounds a month. And we're growing these where we've injected, well, I'll explain that in a minute. This is how the mushroom is actually grown. We can take this little tiny mushroom and we can actually grow large quantities of it, upwards of 50,000 pounds a month. We export mostly to both Chinas. Yes, you had a question?
What's your substrate?
We use different kinds of substrates predicated on which mushroom and which species we're going for, and specifically the chemistry. The substrates change. All of this, again, is proprietary, but, you know, yes. I'm sorry?
It's all vegan. Substrate is all vegan.
Yeah.
Worms and pine beetles.
Yeah, thank you. The quality of the cultivation is that we, have to take into account a whole bunch of habitat or biosphere requirements for each mushroom so that we can grow it correctly. The hybridization technique was to take snake venom and inject it in, and what we did is we did a hybridization where these two different cultures would grow together, and we were looking for the way one would dominate over another one for the polysaccharides or the what we call the immune enhancing qualities of these different mushrooms. And we've done studies on our hybridization over those that are found in the wild. We have certificates of analysis that go with every lot number we grow. Yes, sir?
Why is China, can't they grow their own?
Yeah, they are trying to do that, but they don't have our hybrid form. That's patented, and they would like to. I get at least 5 requests a day from asking for live mycelium. Of course, everything we do is sterilized. We're not about to export our technology over to China. They have been trying to get this one for a long time. That's why we're number one. I mean, we have these patents and so on that we're doing with Aloha Medicinal. These are some of the things that it does. Cordyceps has been shown to shrink tumor size in several clinical studies. There are a series of studies that are now starting to come together for us that we're now showing that the remarkableness of this. It's my opinion that Cordyceps sinensis hybrid will probably be considered the single most important food to come out of the 21st century. It's normally, to individuals, it's $90 a kilo, and it comes in 2.5 kilo tins. But, and for resale, like when Dorman and some of these other people in here, I sell in my 100 kilo price, which is $65 a kilo, or 30 some dollars a pound. It's pretty cheap. Actually, for what we're doing, it's inexpensive. This is, it's a remedy for weakness and fatigue. It increases your cellular ATP or levels in your body, which gives you, it's like ATP is the opposite of speed. It's the same thing that gives you that energy, but you don't have the downside of having to pay off the downside of it, you know, with the come down and all the rest of it, recovery when you're doing speed.
How much do you take a month?
Depends on the individual. For myself, I take 4 of my Performax tablets, or equivalent would be probably half a teaspoon or less a day of powder.
So a pound a month?
I'm sorry?
Pound? You end up taking a pound a month?
Of a teaspoon, of which a pound would be this much, and I'd be taking a little teaspoon of it every day.
So would that last you 2
Probably a year and a half. It's enough to last a very long time. People that are dying of cancer will use up to 3 grams a day, which is maybe 6 to 8 times what normal people would do, and that might give you some stomach disorder or runs or bowel problems. Yes, ma'am.
If you're upping your activity level, if you're upping your energy level, how
Right.
does that affect your adrenals?
This is a non-adrenal thing. Everything that happens, including the adrenals, require ATP to start and to end. It's like the handshake, and then you put the thing in between, which might be your adrenal. For example, it all starts and ends with ATP. If you don't have the ATP, it doesn't matter what you have going on with your adrenal glands. And so the ATP is required for all the different processes in your body, and that's what it does, is increases the ATP levels, so that you can have more of adrenaline rushes if that's what you're seeking, or you can have more of the serotonin. All of them require ATP. You see, it's I'm sorry? I usually take mine in the morning. Boom. Take it throughout the day. If you're taking the powders, we'll talk about this in a minute. If you're taking the powders, I usually take it with an oil base like milk, so that I close the lower valve and leave it in my gut longer. But even the powders only have about 38% absorption. What we need is a new delivery system where you have 100% absorption of the product, and that would have to do, that's, by the way, the importance of ATP. That gives you a more explanation of what ATP is about and what you use it for. Basically, what it is we're delivering monoclustered water on a cellular level. That means you've got Willard water on a cell-by-cell basis and with oxygen. This thing is so high in oxygen, you could probably eat it and live on Mars. I'm kidding. But it's like that. It's like unbelievable. Your body can't get enough oxygen. And that's what this does. That's why I think it's a remarkable food. The chemistry, I dropped a slide. Immune boost, importance of ATP, immune boost. Oh, these are some of the things that it does to the immune system. It increases, these are things that it actually does that we can say legally. I can't tell you it'll get rid of cancer, but I can tell you that we've done some preliminary studies with cancer, and it's eliminating cancer on a 100% basis. It's just taking care of it. It's like what it does is goes after the orphan protein. The mistakes. As we get older, we make more mistakes in our reproduction. And what we need is something that goes in and knocks off those mistakes. And so they are not allowed to grow. And that's what the oxygen does. That's what it does. It causes the cell to trigger up and blow apart if it's not a healthy cell. If it's, written by junk bond proteins. Well, that's what they are. It's called junk DNA. Some of the uniqueness of the things in terms of androgens and the cordyceptines, and some of the uniqueness on the chemistry, which I'm not going to labor you with, other than to tell you that we have what I think to be a remarkable food, just like Holosync is a remarkable brain driver, like certain forms like Tai Chi is a remarkable breathing exercise, And, that's my website, which is at immunoceuticals.nwbotanicals.org. If you wanted to go to my mushroom site, it has immunoceuticals in front of it. And we now have what's called a nanometer product. When I was at Anaheim, there were 7 other universities that were talking about their attempts to make encapsulations in the nanometer size. And one guy was working upward, where he's building this little encasement that would encase foods at 360 nanometers. And the magic number is at 50 nanometers, insolubles will go into solution cloudlessly, like soft drinks. And so to have a 40 nanometer is the desire for delivery systems. Ours is at 50 nanometer. Ours is at 40. And the way I did it, blew them all away because they're still experimenting on making these nanometer things. And we already have a product that's in the nanometer thing. We ran it through a jet engine at Mach 7 and tore it apart. And that, and it's down the size of a small orphan protein slip. And the guy's sitting there from Cornell or some of these other places, mechanical, and his eyes glaze over like, they've forgotten what it was like to be in the real industry where you had to deliver reality, chemistry and so on. The mushroom is available. I have other mushrooms available. My website has maybe 90 pharmaceutical mushrooms that we grow that we have. Each is certified organic. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you too, FDA classifies this as a food. It's not a drug. We got them good, boy. And there's no way they can stop us. And so what we're going to do is put up a performance site for people that are dying of AIDS and so on, where they can buy these individual bottles. The ones that I mostly sell is Performax for weightlifters. This is used by all the weightlifters, people that are high performance that can't have traceability of drugs in their body. This is what they would use for giving, oxygen and so on. That pretty much concludes what I wanted to talk about tonight. I'm open for questions, and we can go anywhere you want to. Yes, sir. Ma'am. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's dark back there.
Valerie Hunt, do you have much familiarity with Valerie Hunt?
No, I don't know him.
It's a lady, Valerie Hunt.
I don't know her.
She did research on healers. She did research on healers, high frequency. She worked at LA. She was an instructor out of
There's been lots of people doing research in this thing. It's the weapons that we made that make me concerned.
Okay.
The research part is okay. It's the weapons or application of it that scares me a lot. Yes, sir.
Speaking of the weapons, there's a lot of scary stories. There's a lot of scary stories about implants that affect the brain.
They don't even need to do implants anymore. The lab where I worked in 1968 had a monkey in the lab next to me with a chip in its head. That's where we did it, is the University of Washington. And the guy on the other side of me, Dr. Moore, Marcia Moore's husband, was doing work with ketamine, telepathine, and BZ, Jacob's ladder drug. And I was the one in the middle. We were real crazy back then. Implants are not necessary anymore. We've got biological chips that are site selective with nanotechnology. We can put it in the drinking water and it'll go right straight where we want it to, the chip now, just from drinking it. We don't even need chips anymore. That was something we used in the 70s. By the 90s, we didn't even need chips.
Aliens still use the chips?
Aliens? I wouldn't know. I haven't talked to one in recent weeks, but probably. If you can imagine it in your mind's eye, most likely it's happening. And more.
You mentioned epilepsy.
Yes, sir.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that was the strobing. I was going to do some strobing, and for epileptics, I could cause some serious problems. I was, and that's what my ex-wife was giving me heads up on, make sure no one here has got epilepsy.
Is there any solution that you know of?
Yes, there are, and sometimes epileptics, yes. I think that some of the frequency following function or holosync things with remapping the brain will help. I believe that that's true. There are some drugs that are being experimented with right now that help remap the brain also. But epileptics were considered your best magicians historically. And they were the ones that could change reality better than most people could. And so there is an important relationship in epilepsy and brain function to what we're talking about here in terms of remapping the brain, being able to change our realities. You had a question?
Yes. I feel like you're really very enthusiastic about this product.
Well, one of them, yeah.
Yeah, and I was just interested, like when you were saying that China would really like to have the mycelium that has the
well, I'm
the
not
hybrid.
going to give them that. What they do is, China's got a lot of heavy problems. They're certified organic with tilth, from Oregon State, and yet all the products that are imported over here, and I'm an expert, are filled with heavy metals. That's why most people don't want to buy products from China, because number one, most of what China sells is not actually honest marketing.
Well, what I'm really trying to say is that there are people with AIDS and there are people with cancer,
Right.
and you're feeling that this is really a solution.
Well, one
and
of-
yet it seems that you want to keep it
In our marketplace.
in your marketplace.
Yeah,
and
not
how,
give it to everybody else and let them take it away from us. You bet.
So
Well,
you're really how
well,
do you
we've spent a
how do
lot
you
of-
feel that you differ from the pharmaceutical mafia, as you called it then?
Well, yeah, in the terms of I'm going to sell it to you as an individual, and I don't think you'll find any other place on earth that will sell it to you for the prices that I'm going to try to sell it to you for. I mean, if you were dying of AIDS,
Most of it is sold in the rest of the world outside the U.S.
yeah, we don't hardly sell anything in North America. All of our markets are both China's, Japan, and some parts of Europe. And that's because I'm not allowed to sell it here.
You're not?
Well, Pfizer went into Ghana right after we did the study and we'd healed like 3,000 of their AIDS victims. They went into the country and made it illegal for me to sell cordyceps to Ghana now because it's competitive to their chemotherapy and radiation treatment, which, in my opinion, is another way of killing you.
Right, that's right.
Well, in my opinion, but you know, and I'm not an expert. What I do have on my website are the clinical studies that we've gone through on it. I'm not going to just casually give it to China because number one, China's not honest in anything that they do, and that's me being in this industry for 30 years in the herb trade and seeing it. I mean, it's terrible what they're doing.
Can you speak quickly
India maybe, but.
about the avian flu?
Well, avian flu is bacterial infection of some kind, and we're finding now like both China's are using our sinensis hybrid, which we have a patent on, as the primary inoculant for an avian, and that's why most of our sales are over to China right now. We're selling like 50,000 pounds a month just for their inoculant in avian flu and some of the other things that they have crud going on over there. I've got lots of people that would like to take our secret and be competitive with us, and I'm not about to do that. So we have some proprietary relationship to our products. We're going to not be just giving our stuff away either. Yeah.
Did you mention Satchel in relation to?
No, I was going to say there's a movie on this imaginary places that you'll enjoy called Sasquatch Mountain that you want to check out. Trust me. I don't know where else to go with you on that other than to simply say that we've worked for years to learn how to grow these mushrooms. I'm not about to teach anybody that wants to know how to grow it. I'll grow them for them, and we'll grow them at a competitive price so that we can make a profit, because that's what we're about, or this company is about. Me, I'm just a speaker. I don't have ownership in. Yes.
I heard a talk from somebody named Joseph who was into Kimber,
Yeah, I do.
and he was talking about how the cordyceps can be used to control the pine beetle.
I don't know about that study. I don't know anything about that.
That was with Paul Stamets. He was
Yeah, Stamets and I studied under, what's his name? Dr. Stunts up at the UW when we took mycology together. That was one of the courses I did up there at the UW years and years ago when I wrote Magical Mushroom Handbook. I did all the studies on psychedelic mushrooms and things like that years ago. This is new. This is brand new. I'm just being brought in, and I'm the physicist for the company trying to talk about what I see as benefits from it. I'm pretty excited about it, whether it's from us or other people. I'm pretty excited because did you know there are 6 species of cordyceps that grows in the world, one of which grows only in Oregon. It's a very unique thing. I don't know where it came from or why it's here. The other four of them grow in Tibet and 1 in China, and 1 grows in Oregon. And what Performax is a blend of all 6 of them, so you're getting all the polysaccharides. And we grow all of them in the laboratory. Like when we get a special hybrid, let's say, for example, we get variation number 12, and we have 6 different cultures of it. We'll select one that's the really good one, and then we're not going to tell everybody which one we selected. We're going to keep that proprietary because that's where our chemistry comes from, and they would like to duplicate us and then compete with us. And what we would like to do is keep our markets to ourselves and try to expand our own. China has been marketing this for centuries, and they are growing it in broth and several other ways like we do. But we think we do a better job. We think we do. You had a question back there.
Can you say just a brief bit about the thing when you concentrate on a thought, there's a wave that comes back and directs your attention elsewhere?
Yeah. What do you want me to say about that?
Just what is the wave and how do you overcome it?
By repeating it. every day in every way, that where you do it over a period of time, where you keep doing it so that it adds up into a basic thought form. That's what Aleister Crowley's Magical Child book was about. Remember, he wrote a book called Magical Child. Well, Joseph Chilton wrote one later called Magical Child, but he didn't spell magic the same way either. And but Magical Child was with a K, with Aleister Crowley, and that was World War II. That's what the child was. That was the creation, was World War II. The Moravians and so on. That was his postulate on that. Yes, sir?
A couple things. I want to know about these devices that you can buy to check, electromagnetic fields.
I'm thinking of putting a catalog together that has devices that you can make yourself, from little parts out of Radio Shack, or you can buy like biofeedback. There's a bunch of different, really good systems on biofeedback that are inexpensive. What was the one you were talking about, Ayanna? What group was that?
Probably get them from Nick Beggett at Earth.
Yeah, Nick Beggett and Earth Pulse. There's different groups of them. I'm going to probably put a catalog together at some point if I get into the lecturing, where you can get some of your gizmos and devices. I have stuff that you can download off my site also that you can make yourself, like monitoring your electromagnetic fields in a room or something. There's a small, simple device. I have a thing that you can do with some parts from Radio Shack. You can make something yourself in your own home and be able to monitor yourself on that. More questions?
And the other question I had was,
Yes.
Me and my ex-partner were targets from the authorities on using some strange mind control things, and we experienced. She believed she has psychic abilities, but they actually were able to implant, a thought or a psychic experience.
Well, you can
into
drop
her.
that. On my website is a paper called Synthetic Telepathy in the Early Mind Wars, and there's websites on where you can buy these devices on each one of these things, and there's a whole raft of weapons that came out of the studies we did. And now, that's 30 years ago. I can only imagine what they're doing now. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, I can't imagine.
How can you counter these things?
What?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Walmart has them now. Yeah, that's
Rick,
right.
this gentleman wanted to know how
I don't think
to.
there's any way to combat them, because I used to have students that would come to class with aluminum foil on their head, and that isn't going to work. No. That was like crazy stuff, They thought they were going to shield themselves. Let me explain. Microwave is so fine a frequency, it's in the microwave band. Now, the presidential bunker is up here on the hill. I don't know if any of you knew that or not, but the actual presidential bunker is right here between Grants Pass and Rogue River. And it's in the caves. And it's not in Colorado anymore. And there's a science fiction story called The Sword of Allah that takes place in Grants Pass, Oregon. The last chapter takes place in Grants Pass, Oregon, where some weird radicals from Ashland get a hold of the presidential bunker, and they lock. What happens is a blue turbaned Ayatollah aims a couple of particle beams into the sun. It creates artificial sunspots, and as the Earth turns, it's sterilized with radiation. And everybody's trying to flee it. And the last chapter takes place where these radicals have gotten into the presidential bunker, and they won't let the president in. Yeah, it's a very good movie. It's called The Sword of Allah. But let me explain something for a minute. Imagine that you had a screw in your wall that was 260 threads, whoomp, 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 whoomp. Microwave would just walk right through that. It just ricocheted between each thing. Ricochet, 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 ricochet. Goes right on straight through with no loss of amplitude. Microwave is a serious problem in terms of there is no shielding. And that's why we're in the soup that we are, and probably sick like we are, because of all the devices that we use. And it's not right. And we need to be aware of trying to, like you pick up your litter, you just don't use this as much, which I don't. I don't use it. It's emergency, but I don't use it. I mean, if I have any way to not use it, I won't. I will. Because not only, when I open this, not only is this poisonous to me right here, it's poisonous to you because of the atmospheric things that it creates. Secondary. What's that? And they know where you are. They know where you are. Listen, do you know how many times you're photographed every day? and from different stores and banks and streets and everything else? What's the number you came up with, Iona? 35 pictures of you are made every day of you in some capacity.
I got another question.
Yes.
Here.
Yes.
When you're using HemiSync programs with your computer, can you use external speakers instead of headphones?
Yes. Actually, Holosync requires headphones. You have to have the brain drivers right there at your ear. You need to use headphones for the Holosync to work effectively, and virtual audio will not work as well from speakers as it will from your headphone. Because when you have a closed sound, put your hands over your head like this so you can hear your echoing and so on. There's a series of things that happen that are extremely important in the way you would heterodyne your sound. Yes.
Okay. Hi.
About what? Chemtrails. I'll do that another time. Chemtrails are, my website has the ABC of chemtrails under the forum. My current forum is on chemtrails, and it has some very interesting articles, including how HAARP was used to start the weather changes in Iraq for the invasion of Iraq.
I know you
Yes.
have personal experience with Holosync, and
sorry?
I know you have personal experience with Holosync, and I started using it too, but I switched to something called Insight and Focus.
Yes,
by
I'm
Awaken
familiar
Mind.
with Insight. That's also a very good system.
Is it good? Okay.
He has some brain entrainment concepts that are different and better than Centerpoint.
Because I've been having excellent results
I
with it.
understand that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's as a matter of fact, that's when I told you I'm using new systems. Yes. Well, what they're doing is they have some other physics that they're using in terms of the way they do their embedding, which is very important in terms of structuring how the Holosync systems work. It's still Holosync. It's the same, but he's using different embedding technologies. But Holosync in their round twos, ma'am, Holosync is using virtual audio, and nobody else is using virtual audio except Holosync groups now out of Centerpoint. And that makes them, in some ways, superior. You know those affirmation discs that they have for weight loss and things like that? That's using virtual audio in there. That technology is ultra. Now, the virtual audio laboratory doesn't cost that much, and at some point, if I get enough money, I'd like to set up a small, where we make our own things, right? Okay. Yes. Right. Wild divine. Yes. Yes, sir.
Scalar waves.
Scalar waves are lesser. That means they're a reflection, like a shadow is to your body. A scalar would be the shadow of your body. That's what a scalar means. Scalar means lesser. It's a matrix or tensor form of something more. That's what scalar means.
So are they using that in the system you refer to micro?
No, you're thinking of Bearden and his works as an engineer. He was only an engineer, by the way. His works are interesting, but basically scalar waves are lesser waves. If your physical body is what you're talking about, a scalar of your physical body would be your shadow. You understand? Okay, it's like a matrix form of a hologram. It's lesser, it's compacted. That's what made scalars interesting, is it's a way of taking information and compacting it into less dimensions. That's what a scalar is. Scalar is a lesser dimension. That's what scalar means. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
So what does it do when you sit in the scalar field with 8 computers beaming at you? What does it do?
I'm not sure. What are they beaming? Scotty or his alcohol? What? I don't know. I'm not sure what you're saying, because some of that is a misuse of terminology. Okay? There you go. And that's the difference between being physics or an engineer. You're a little more uppity about that. You had a last question.
Yeah. At my house, I have a geodesic dome.
Oh, yes, of course you do.
And
Of course you do.
somebody came by. We have big power lines up and down my street.
Neighbors. I've seen that video.
They came by measuring the EMF fallout
Yeah.
from the power lines, and
Your
they stopped.
geodesic dome showed less.
They couldn't pick up any in front of my
Right.
house.
Uh-huh.
And so I was assuming that it's grounding the random energy.
No, it's not. Hard to tell what's really happening there. Several things could be happening, including him affecting his readings because of his belief system. We used to call belief systems, by the way, cultural viruses that would leave so many dead. You know, like religions. You know, you have a belief system, it's a disease. You know, in our physics, we used to think of those as diseases. And so the way you isolate variables in measuring things, like, you know, took all the energy away. What energy was he measuring? You know, how was he measuring? There's a lot of questions I would have on that to know precisely what he's really trying to say to you. I am right into Buckminster Fuller, let me tell you. We embrace the vector equilibrium matrix. The vector equilibrium matrix is that first point of forming the geodesic dome, and the center of it is a mathematical impossibility, can't exist. And so we used to think of the vector equilibrium matrix as a tunnel or a gate, dimensional gate, because the center can't exist as a mathematical concept. That's one of the things that Buck's math showed that was very interesting. We've written extensively on that on the website, and Iona's website, called The Diamond Body, Electromagic, and Yogatronics. There are 3 books on video feedback systems using Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome concepts. Last question. Yes, ma'am.
Are you familiar with this physicist whose name starts with an M that has come up with a theory that is beyond quantum physics?
Nassim Haramein.
Yeah.
Whom?
Nassim Haramein.
No.
What he's doing is he's created a system that creates energy.
Oh.
And it's the 64-star tetrahedron.
Oh. I'll have to think about that a little bit in terms of sacred geometry and Vedic math, but I'll say that the holographic concept is one of the alternatives to quantum mechanics that's now being offered. It's not a better system. I think it's more practical in terms of what we're trying to do, but it's not a better system. It's a different system, a different way of looking at things. And what we do is we talk about information and resolution of information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.